In a city built on glass towers and older, quieter loyalties, Lila Rahman arrives at her wedding under the weight of 1,000 quiet assumptions. She is the village girl who fell in love with Omar Hale, the scion of a powerful conglomerate, mocked by Omar's family for her plain manners and threadbare sari. Lila appears to accept the humiliation with bowed shoulders, but beneath her soft voice lies a life of careful strategy. She is the anonymous founder of a disruptive environmental tech company whose quiet rise has been financing social programs across the region. And she holds the decisive share that can topple or mend the Hale empire. When an attempted merger would erase the livelihoods she has protected, Lila refuses to be collateral. She cancels a $950 million deal in a courtroom of optics and ethics, exposing greed, reclaiming dignity, and forcing a reckoning that reshapes family, power, and identity. This cinematic story traces humiliation into strength, love into negotiation, and the cost of choosing dignity over convenience. The old mosque bell chimed, as if reluctant to part with the hour. Its sound braided into the greater noise of the city honking, a motorbike that never quite obeyed speed limits, the soft bell of a fruit vendor weaving through pedestrians. Lila Rahman moved through it all like a woman practiced in shrinking and expanding at will. Her sari was the color of river mud, a fabric that had softened with prayer and time. The gold at its edge caught the sun in modest, dutiful flashes. She kept her hands folded in front of her, as if keeping a cup warm. The house of the Hales sat beyond the market, a stone thing with the kind of windows that watched the street. They had arranged the party in a marble room with orchids in glass vases and a quartet playing, an apprehensive quartet of Western strings. Lila had been invited to the house as a bride, invited to be remade. They had said the wedding would be simple, with only family. They like an old-fashioned thing. Omar had told her on the phone, at once apologetic and proud. Lila had said nothing about the village songs she wanted to sing. That would have been theatrical at a time like this. She accepted the invitation like someone accepting a tide, a thing both inevitable and mutable. The groom's family arrived in pulses, men in tailored coats that looked as if they had been stitched from the city's favorable weather, women with jewels that glittered like small suns. Mrs. Hale, Margaret, moved with the discreet cruelty of someone who had learned to judge as a profession. Her pearls were a single strand, white as the teeth of a well-kept story. Beside her stood Julian, Omar's older brother, broad and genial in the public way of men trained to inherit, and his wife, Sienna, who looked at Lila as if one might examine a specimen through a glass slide. "How quaint," Sienna murmured to Margaret when Lila had smiled at a passing aunt. The words were meant for Lila alone, and yet they glided through the room, touchstones for the murmurs that followed. Layla felt the sting, then a coolness. She had known this would occur. Intelligence had taught her many things, including how to wear an insult like an old shawl and not let it hurt the skin beneath. She greeted them in the old customs, bowing slightly, smiling. Her hands, which had built shelves and counted inventory in a workshop long before Omar had ever suggested marriage, did not tremble. They had work to do that was sometimes invisible to outside eyes. Omar arrived late, a quiet, apologetic energy in his movement. He had been born into a world carted out in clean lines. Boardrooms, strategic philanthropy, photos where he smiled from the corner of the frame. He loved Layla for a reason he could not catalog, for the way she could unpeel him of the parts he had built himself around. They had met, she told people later, in a rain that had no sense of honor. He had been in a cab that refused to start. She had lent the driver a wrench, laughed at his cursed engine, and in the laughter he had heard a tune he wanted to remember. Their flirtation had been small, almost stupid. Shared samosas at a sidewalk stall, debates over whether jazz made a city smaller or larger. She had joked once, "I will be a small, useful person, and you will be vast and frightening. And he had smiled like a man who had not yet learned the contours of what a vow might demand. The reception moved like ritual, speeches were made, wine was poured. Margaret Hale gave a toast with a smile that had been practiced at family gatherings and never updated. To new beginnings, she said, and the words moved like a net, delicate and catching. Lila stood, the Sauri a modest river against the black and cream of the room, and spoke her lines with the calm of someone who had once run a village library and seen the slow arrival of readers take on the cadence of the rain. Then, the small fissures became a canyon. Julian, with a glance like a mapmaker redrawing boundaries, spoke in a voice meant to be charming. Of course, we look forward to seeing how Lila adapts to our world. His wife smiled like a photograph in motion. Oh, we have certain expectations, she added, all the while arranging the napkin on her lap so that the gold thread caught the light like a cuff. There was laughter from the right sort of corners, heads nodded, someone made a joke about tradition. Layla nodded back. Her insides were a weather system, cool, planned. She had not expected deference here. She had expected a kind of scrutiny, and she had written for it. All the same, she had not expected Margaret Hale to lean forward like a shark and draw the audience closer to her mouth. "Tell us about your family, Mrs. Rahman," Margaret said with the delicate cruelty of someone offering a small, poisoned gift. "The Rahmans are from the Ganges," Layla said. "We grow rice. My father taught me to count seed." A few voices made polite sounds. "How very rustic," Sienna murmured. It sounded as if she tasted something left out. Omar's hand found Layla's beneath the table. It was a small, grounding pressure. He squeezed once, twice. He wore a suit that had been pressed into submission, the cuffs immaculate. "I like rice," he said, supplying defense as if it were a trained instrument. "It keeps us human." The mocking light changed to something harder. A man seated at the end of the table, Elias Dane, the conglomerate's chief negotiator, and a man who had negotiated rivers out of towns for the sake of profit, took a sip of wine and appraised Lila as if she were a ledger. "So you grew rice?" he said, not quite a question. "And you run a charity? A workshop?" "We run an environmental design firm," said Lila. Her voice did not betray heat. "We make water filters and sustainable cooking stoves, and we help set up micro businesses. It's small. Small can be quaint," Margaret replied. "But you must understand, dear, that our merger talks require certain capabilities we can't have." She let the word dangle, unpredictability, as if to be poor and alive was an aesthetic mismatch for a corporate merger. A silence pooled. Layla felt the room as a thing pressed against her. She inhaled, tasted saffron and cold air, and in that breath decided how much of herself to reveal. There are times when the honest answer is a human shield and other times when it cuts deeper. She chose a middle path. "We have patents," she said. "Not many, but we have customers." "Patents," Elias said, amused and insinuating. "In sustainable stoves. Forgive me, Mrs. Rahman, I didn't imagine you were a capitalist." Omar blinked, the amusement on his face gone like a stage light. He had not told them everything. Why would he? Love had a habit of bouqueting ruinous facts into romantic tales, and Omar had not thought, perhaps, that his wife's past mattered to the board. Layla could see the calculation cross his face. He wanted to protect her, but he also wanted to avoid splitting the family's table into saline and fresh water. "She's practical," he said. "She knows how to run things." That night, after the guests had left and the house settled into a hush like a held breath, Lila sat with Omar on the terrace. The lights of the city lay like distant grains of sugar. He placed a hand over hers, the connection thin and sincere. "They came at you," he said, not angry so much as guilty. They test. It's what they do." "I know what they do," Layla answered. "I also have to decide what to do." "You could walk away," Omar said, worried. "What could leave their world altogether?" We could disinherit them. She finished, smiling. No. I would rather teach them how to be better. Omar's laughter was small. You talk as if they have never. As if they've never seen an acre of land by sunrise. She met his eyes, the challenge real and gentle. Omar, I'd rather do nothing than be changed into something I'm not. He studied her like a man trying to understand a poem, in a language he half known. He loved her stubbornness, but he did not yet comprehend the full gravity of her work. After the wedding, when the champagne had settled in the tray, a meeting was called. The board wanted a status on a merger that would place the Hales industrial arm into alignment with a massive infrastructure fund. The number was whispered like an incantation, $950 million. Elias Dane produced the projections with the ease of a conjurer. This merger secures long-range logistics, energy efficiency, and it eliminates a competitor. The boardroom was a long room whose windows looked down on a river. The river had been redirected once by the company's contracts. There were stories in low voices about the fish that had left for other waters. Y will acquire a 40% stake in Kestrel Systems. Primary focus, water filtration and residential energy, at a valuation that makes strategic sense. This is a decisive move. Omar sat at the table as a man who loved Lila, but lived in a world where numbers were gods. He had not, until that moment, realized Kestrel's ownership would interfere. Kestrel Systems was the secret thread that ran through Layla's work. She had named it Kestrel not out of romance, but because the bird, small and hungry, had a bite to it that could survive in scarce weather. I had not realized, Omar said carefully. Kestrel is a small company. He looked at Lila in a way that asked permission and begged for truth. It is small but effective, Lila said. We have a pilot program in 500 villages. We have micro loans that are repaid and reinvested. We have people who are no longer buying water in plastic jugs. Julian made a small gesture. Half sympathetic, half bored. Hale will require assurances, he said, and the pronoun landed like a hammer. Elias smiled like an optimizer. With the Hale network behind it, Kestrel could scale exponentially, bring in capital, improve manufacturing, streamline supply chains. Think of it, we place Kestrel's units in our developments and the synergy. The synergy will be measured in profit, Layla said, not in water. There are ways to measure both, Elias countered. With the right KPIs, both mission and profit can align. What if my company refuses to be swallowed? Layla asked, quiet as a knife. The room gave the sort of silence that shows preparation for either a speech or a sword. Elias leaned in. There are offers. We can make it very attractive to your shareholders. You would buy them out? Layla said. You will build units that are throwaway versions. You will flood markets with cheap components, and the craft people I trained will be replaced with assembly lines. That is not alignment, it's erasure. The board glanced at Omar then, searching for the man who could marry two worlds. He opened his mouth, then closed it. His silence tasted like fear. The marriage had placed him between a family he had outgrown in one way and the love he had chosen. We are not monsters, Julian said. We'll bring scale. And we also court influence. Elias added with a smile that was not quite daylight. Large projects mean government contacts. One contract snowballs into others. Risk is minimized, revenue assured. Lila watched them ask the world to be small enough for their greed. Her palms were steady. If you acquire us, she said, you will be buying more than a company. You will be buying the lives that rely on it. I won't sell Kestrel at any price that sacrifices the people who keep it alive. There was a pause, a sort of legal hush that curves around declarations. The board murmured about ethics, due diligence, fiduciary responsibilities. You cannot hold the company hostage. Elias said finally, decorative and brittle. We could go to tender. Omar, you know the investors. You would use your influence? Layla said. And you would hollow us out. The phrase hollow us out echoed in the room like a bell. Omar's jaw worked. He loved Layla, but the board had been his life's geography rotes and shingles and long meetings. He had been raised to temper heart with ledger. If Kestrel was left independent, the Hales would lose a strategic asset. If Kestrel sold, Lila's people would be sacrificed at the altar of efficiency. A deal for $950 million made the choice seem both simple and monstrous. Lila slept badly that week, not with fear, but with a ledger of obligations in her gut. She went to Kestrel's warehouse at dawn, where the machine still smelled like hot metal and the women tied knots in the wire mesh that would become a core of a filtration unit. She sat among them, learning the names of their children like an incantation. They will come to you. A woman named Basma told her quietly. They will come and ask where their stoves have gone. When the merger talks accelerated, weekdays became a blur of lawyers and strategy. Elias moved with the confidence of a man in a Navy suit who believed in inevitability. He traveled with glossy presentations and a willingness to fold anything into columns. He offered Omar an appointment on a yacht, then a place at a private dinner. He courted the shareholders like a lover practicing seduction. At the same time, he tried to be polite to Lila, an animal handling its keepers with a smile. "You amaze me, Mrs. Rahman," he said once, in a voice that suggested that this amazement could be commodified. To build a company with so little and do so much. "You can buy such amazement," she replied. "You can buy the factory, the patents, maybe even the hearts, but you can't buy the trust of a village." Elias took the comment to his ledger and marked it as quaint. Elila began to quaint. Gad on paper, but on the pulse of what she had made. If a merger meant exchange, she could choose how the exchange happened. She could design a covenant, a way for capital to be married to community and not scrape it clean. She began to draft a charter, terms that would guarantee local ownership in decision-making, maintenance training to keep parts, repairable, microloan covenants that could not be nullified by assembly line efficiencies. She brought Omar in as an ally. He listened and argued with the nervous affection of someone learning the grammar of a world he had taken for granted. "You're asking them to be philanthropic while being profitable," he said once. "That's like asking the sea to stop being wet." "Not philanthropy," Layla said. "Embedded rights. Contracts that travel with goods. We can protect livelihoods without being naive." The boat of compromise drifted towards a harbor one morning when Kestrel Primaris offered to underwrite part of the merger, but only if the Haynes guaranteed certain logistical contracts and an exclusive supply deal. The number was no longer a rumor, but a fixed figure, $950 million, give or take. The Hales board circulated the numbers quickly, as if money could anesthetize the ethical jitters. "You can stand your ground," Omar told Lila, the tenderness of a man trying to hold both hands of a fragile vase. "But you have to know I can't cross every battle. There are shareholders, Julian's children, our staff. And there are Basma's children," Lila said. "There are the men in Kestrel who would lose their small shops. If you are to be a company that claims stewardship, you should steward." Omar was quiet for a long time, the pallor of decision painting his forehead. Love had taught him to be brave in particular ways. Corporate life demanded braveries scripted in fine print. He left the room then to speak with his father, and when Omar returned, his face was a map of compromise. "How would you make it ironclad?" he asked Layla. She handed him a document. Simple language, legal scaffolding, guaranteeing local procurement, ensuring that the Hales would be required to uphold Kestrel's maintenance training programs and to keep local pricing structures intact for 5 years, with penalties for breach. "If they agree to this," she said, "then the merger could expand our reach without displacing the people who make it possible." Omar's eyes softened. "Send it to Elias." They did. The board read. They circled numbers and lined questions with red. Elias entered the room like a man with a broom sweeping through a school assembly. "This is unusual," he said, like a judge reading an eccentric will. "You tie us down with constraints that hamper our ability to earn returns. Shareholders won't accept it. They may accept it if you put the value of compliance into the model," Lila said. "If you demonstrate that local buy and protects long-term revenue by reducing churn and maintaining reputation." Elias smiled with the exhaustion of a man who had not been told no enough to be surprised. "It's a lovely theory. It isn't finance. We do not live in a vacuum," Layla replied. "We live in rivers and markets and trust." The negotiations became a weather system. Press releases were prepared. Lawyers circled clauses like sharks forming a ring. Margaret Hale, sensing instability, called a family meeting. She stood at the head of the table in the old study, where portraits of Hale ancestors hung like a tribunal. "You're making waves," she told Omar. "Don't forget what we are. What we are is a company that wants to thrive without becoming a rumor," Omar said. "We are also people." Margaret's lip curled. "People who are responsible to investors," she replied, as if duty were the only god she worshipped. "You would ask me to put a price on dignity," Lila said calmly. "You would ask us to sacrifice the workers so that the board may sleep well." The argument ended in cold civility. The merger press conference was scheduled in the city's glass atrium, a place where light showed off the polished teeth of corporations. Cameras gathered like gulls. The number, 950 million, hung like a star above the room, affectionate and distant. Omar stood beside Lila, like a man awaiting his final act. Elias gave the speech first, bright and sure. "This merger is a milestone," he said. "Scaling logistics, a future with cleaner water for millions." He folded his hands, measured applause, chalked up the future in neat columns. Then Lila spoke. She had not intended to. The press had been promised a joint statement. Omar as business scion, Lila as soft spouse. But she felt the city beneath her shoes, a geography of faces who had lent her the currency of trust. Her lips shaped the words before she consulted with anyone. "This is the kind of merger that can make lives better or make them vanish," she said. Her voice was at first small, then generous, then unembarrassed. "I began Kestrel because I could not watch people buy water in expensive, disposable bottles when we had the technology to make clean water accessible. We designed our units to be repairable with a few tools. We trained women to maintain them. We made sure profits circled back into the villages." A dozen cameras blinked. Elias's smile grew thin. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "We have designed proposals to ensure this," Layla went on. "I have offered guarantees. I have written contracts so that the Hales must uphold local procurement and maintenance programs. I have given you a way to expand without trampling the people who make the expansion possible." Elias approached the podium with the smooth intent of a man about to take a stage. "Mrs. Rahman," he said, voice shiny, "this is a board decision. We have investors. We have a schedule." "You have investors and a schedule," Lila said. "But if our model becomes a cosmetic in your developments, then the filters will clog and the maintenance contracts will be ignored because no one will be paid to fix it. You will buy the units but not the skills to keep them alive." For a moment, the room held its breath. Then a small, papered envelope was slid to Lila by a junior associate, an addendum to the contract, an unsigned clause that offered an option. The Hales could acquire a controlling stake that would allow them to rewrite Kestrel's charter. The option was elegantly cruel. It preserved a legacy only in the thin air. Lila opened the envelope, read it, and smiled without warmth. "You intend to buy us and then buy our rights away," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was magnetic. "That is not a merger. That is appropriation. The clause exists for flexibility," Elias said. "It's standard. Standard for acquisitions, maybe." Layla shot back, but not for communities. She could have chosen to fight in court over each clause, to scalp the legal jargon with slow attrition. Instead, she chose the simplest instrument she had: refusal. "I will not sign," she said. "Kestrel will not be sold under terms that allow for the disbanding of our local structures." A murmur rose. Cameras focused with predatory glee. The Hales board had prepared a launch. Instead, they had a refusal. Investors were contacted. Legal counsels assembled urgently. Elias wore the air of a man betrayed by arithmetic. Margaret laughed, a brittle, high sound. "This is personal, then." "It is personal," Lila admitted. "Everything that concerns people's sustenance is personal." In the hours that followed, the story devoured the city. Headlines asked whether a bride had stood in the way of a historic merger. Opinion pieces spun like propellers. Some framed Lila as a romantic obstructionist, others as an ethical sentinel. Shareholders, trained to think of liquidity as an emotion, shrieked. Julian called his father in a voice sharp as an invoice. The board convened emergency meetings. "You realize what this will cost?" Julian demanded of Omar in a hall of fluorescent light. $950 million is not a rounding error. It is a decision about people, Omar said. "For once, let our business be human." "You are siding with a woman who refuses to cooperate," Julian said, the accusation flat and expensive. "I'm siding with what I think is right," Omar replied. His heart thrummed with a new kind of sovereignty, one that placed his wife's values in the center of his life. "If we compromise our ethics for profit, what then is left?" Elias moved to legal maneuvers, arguing breach of fiduciary duty, threats of forced sales, litigation so thick with clauses that one could drown in them. He lined up investors with secret appetites for control. He painted a grim picture of stock prices plunging and of careers being trampled beneath the wheels of public reaction. Layla's phone started to sing with messages, support from environmental groups, offers of alternative investors, petitions, and threats. Basma knit quietly as the digital noise turned into a swell of voices that hinted at something fragile. A public opinion that could be a tide. A few entrepreneurs with conscience and capital approached Kestrel's board with offers to buy stakes but pledged to honor the charter. A media magnate suggested turning Kestrel into a model for ethical acquisitions. Elias pivoted. "You will not be able to run Kestrel without capital," he said. "It will wither." "Maybe," Layla replied. "Or we will learn to grow in new patterns." The climax was a day arranged like a court of weather, a televised shareholder meeting in which the board would vote on the acquisition. The atrium was full. Cameras obediently angled. Inside the room, men in suits read their tablets like constellations. Lila sat in the audience with Omar at her side. She had not come as an adversary, but as the steward of the company she had built. Basma and other workers were there, faces lined and patient. A group of small investors, people who were public-minded, sat with nervous pride. Elias spoke with the nice cadence of certainty. He presented spreadsheets, growth curves, models of economies of scale. He weighed probabilities like a hand on a scale. He wore the arrogance of someone who had reduced story to number. Then Lila stood. She did not bring a PowerPoint. She brought a woman who had learned to fix a filter on a rainy night while the child of a neighbor slept in a hammock. She told that woman's story. She spoke not in data, but in devotion, the sound of a motor being oiled at midnight. The time a village had pooled the money to buy a replacement filter and refused to let a corporation dictate who could fix it. She spoke of the consequences of being cheapened, how disposable technology breeds dependency. She spoke of dignity as if it were a thing made of threads, delicate and necessary. When she finished, a kind of hush fell. It was the hush of people hearing a sound they had avoided until now. Then the vote was taken. It was not an immediate no. Investors who had been leaning on liquidity shifted like grass, unsure. Julian's vote was a thunder, Margaret's a huff. Omar's vote, quiet and decisive, was a no. His no was the fulcrum. In the end, the vote failed to reach the needed threshold. The Hale's board had miscalculated the gravity of a public conscience. Elias's face, stripped of performance, hardened. "You have cost us," he said to Lila later in a narrow hallway. $950 million. "I have saved people," she replied. "You understand the ramifications," he demanded. "This won't just be numbers. This is precedent." "Then let there be precedent," Lila said. "Let it be known that corporations must negotiate honestly with people whose lives they will alter." The aftermath was a slow recentering. The Hales had to recompose their strategy. Investors took time, some left, but others, stirred by the public reaction, came in with terms that honored the charter. Kestrel negotiated alternative financing, a combination of patient capital, community investment, and a philanthropic anchor that refused to sell out. The company restructured. Lila added a community board seat that could veto terms threatening livelihoods. Omar became an advocate within his own family, an odd and quiet thing to watch, arguing for culture to be worth the short-term sacrifice. Margaret, who had watched her social map redraw itself, softened in a way that resembled thawing ice. She called Lila late one evening, voice brittle contrite. "You were brave," she said after a long pause. "Perhaps I was unwise." Lila accepted the apology and, in that acceptance, recognized the economy of kindness. It yields returns. She did not relish the collapse of their marriage's assumption into boardroom drama. She had come into the Hale family because she had chosen Omar, and she wanted to hold that marriage with tenderness, not weaponize it. Omar, for his part, had gained a new currency, the respect of a man who realizes that love can be the reason for radical change. Months after the vote, Kestrel's units hummed in villages with maintenance logs full and local craftsmen employed. Basma's son got a scholarship. The Hales started a foundation that invested in local procurement for any company they touched. Elias, whose life had been negotiation refined into steel, left the conglomerate for a quieter life, running a hedge fund that promised returns without human stories. He sent an email to Layla a year later, short and oblique. "You changed the calculus." Layla forwarded it to Omar with a laughing face. In the end, Layla did not become a myth. She remained a woman who fixed things. She continued to walk to the warehouse at dawn, sleeves rolled, hair tied in a purposeful knot. The sari she wore that day at the wedding became one of many. Sometimes she stood before an audience and spoke about ethical commerce. Other times she sat with a woman who needed help writing loan applications. She never forgot the sting of that first night at the Hales table. She used it as a map rather than a wound. Omar learned to listen before he led. He came to meetings not as an instrument of wealth, but as a translator between two languages, the vocabulary of balance sheets and the grammar of people's lives. Their love did not become a patriotic narrative of heroism. It became, instead, a labor of translation, sometimes awkward, sometimes miraculous. Years later, when the city had new buildings and certain corners were softened by communal gardens, funded by Kestrel's social investments, a young woman came to the warehouse asking for work. She had the look of someone used to being invisible. Lila, who had been invisible herself at another table, smiled and handed the girl a list of tasks. "Start by learning to oil a motor," she said. "Then see whether you like the way things hum when they work." The girl worked, and the machine sang. In that song, Lila heard the city change, one careful, ordinary act at a time. She had canceled a deal that could have made her a footnote in the calculus of profit. Instead, she chose the slipperiness of consequence and dignity. The $950 million that had glittered so seductively had been a test, not of how much she could wield wealth, but of whether she could keep its human face intact.